The Department of Homeland Security is warning of copycat attacks following the hostage standoff situation last month at a Texas synagogue. In a new terror threat bulletin, the agency says supporters of foreign terrorist organizations have encouraged similar attacks. It also says the incident, quote, highlights the continuing threat of violence based upon racial or religious motivations, as well as threats against faith-based organizations. The agency mentions the recent bomb threats directed at historically black colleges and universities. Those incidents, in addition to attacks on Jewish facilities and churches, are causing concern over extremist violence. For more on this topic, I want to bring in CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter Nicole Sganga. Nicole, welcome. And before we get into the details of the bulletin, I know that Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff was rushed out of an event Tuesday due to a bomb threat. What do you know about this?
Yeah, Lilia, we're happy to report that Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff is safe after being ushered out of that event at Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. by a Secret Service detail following a bomb threat to the building he was in. His spokesperson, or the spokesperson rather, for his office thanked Secret Service and D.C. police for their work in assisting his safe evacuation. A spokesperson for the Secret Service I spoke to told me that there's no information to indicate the threat was directed toward Mr. Emhoff. Metropolitan Police, meanwhile, have said that bomb threat was made by telephone. And while the investigation over who was behind it is ongoing, police do have that audio on hand. Unfortunately, Lilia, today's incident, which appears to be purely coincidental with the second gentleman's appearance, does underscore DHS's warning, that warning you mentioned, which makes specific mention of continued calls for violence directed at soft targets and mass gatherings, including schools and institutions of higher education.
You know, the timing is concerning at the least. Now back to that DHS warning. We mentioned that supporters of foreign terrorist organizations are pushing for copycat attacks. Do you know more? Who might be behind these threats? Tell us what you found.
One of the things that Homeland Security officials are particularly concerned about is the greater level of specificity in calls for targeted violence against faith-based institutions, government buildings, institutions of higher learning, as we just mentioned in recent days, calls specifically for mass shootings, the use of vehicles, or what we call car attacks, knife attacks, and comments by ISIS and al-Qaeda-aligned commentators online point to Colleyville as a shining example of the types of attacks that should be carried out within the United States. Analysts at DHS have also seen reflections on white supremacist platforms that noted that the hostage taker in that case didn't kill anyone, raising concerns of even more lethal violence in the future. So we're beginning to see a real blending of ideologies here in the threat environment's online echo chamber, both foreign and domestic threat actors engaging on extremist platforms, including encrypted apps. The primary terrorism-related threat to the U.S. continues to stem from lone offenders or small individuals, small cells of individuals, rather, according to that bulletin. And those kinds of warnings are hard for federal law enforcement to spot. There's less dots for them to connect prior to attacks. Just to give you a sense of the threat environment, the ADL, their most recent audit of anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. recorded more than 2,100 acts of assault, vandalism, harassment, an increase of 12% over the previous year. Cyber threats in particular have ticked up, with concerns now that increases in live streaming of religious services amid the pandemic will further inspire attackers who view streaming online as a way of amplifying their actions.
You know, it's just so worrisome to think about how people are communicating and how hard it is to track, you know, these apps and these encrypted platforms. Now, you mentioned threats against faith-based institutions and against historically black colleges and universities. How's the government protecting these sites and any other site that in a similar way would be vulnerable to this kind of violence?
Well, DHS Secretary Mayorkas and Education Secretary Cardona had actually briefed HBCU presidents and leaders just 1 week before the string of attacks played out, or rather threat of attacks played out. One DHS official also told me yesterday that they've addressed literally thousands of faith leaders on conference calls in the week since that attack in Colleyville, Texas, increasing their biweekly security briefings with leaders of the Jewish communities and others, more frequent check-ins and issuing of intelligence memos as more information becomes available. Today, we did hear from Rabbi Citron Walker, who was inside Beth Israel, his own congregation, about his experience being held hostage and the type of training from federal law enforcement that he actually received prior. And we learned that the rabbi actually attended about a half dozen security trainings, including a faith-based security summit hosted by DHS and FBI, which really prompted his congregation to form a security subcommittee. But certainly there's more work to be done, more security grant funding, more security trainings to be carried out. In fact, leaders from historically black colleges and universities spoke out today at a panel held by the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's a group that tracks extremist threats. And two things really stood out to me. One, beyond physical security enhancements, these schools are going to need further mental health resources for students that are now processing racially motivated bomb threats on their campuses, already amid this very stressful pandemic time and more generally a time of heightened racial tensions in the United States. And two, given that the FBI's early investigation so far has revealed that juveniles were behind these recent threats made to HBCUs, educators have underscored the importance of teaching students about the history of racial discrimination in this country, what you were just speaking about with the Congresswoman, the through lines to the civil rights movement and the atrocities of the KKK and others.
You know, with so much misinformation online and just, you know, the kinds of messaging that people and especially young people are receiving on top of the pandemic, on top of an existing pandemic, you could call it, or an epidemic of mental health among American youth. I mean, it's really hard for teachers, educators to compete, but hopefully some of those steps you mentioned will be taken and soon. Nicole Sganga, thank you.
Thank you.